So today we have a special guest, two special guests, Jill and Rachel. Will be discussing bulletproofing your transaction. So thank you so much to them and for Mary for setting this up. Before we get rolling into that, just a couple of market center notes. So you guys, if you are staying with Dot Loop, you probably have seen this information come across your inbox. But if you are planning on staying with Dot Loop, you do need to make sure that you've set up your account with them so that you can be billed separately and you can retain your account moving forward. So I will put our sales rep, Adam, I'll put his contact information in the chat, but he does recommend that you set up your account before the end of May, just for billing purposes so that there's not any gaps when our contract ends June 15th. So that's just a small thing. And I'll put his info in the chat when here in a second. And then also just end of month is coming. So for your commission checks that are at the end of this week, just make sure that they're turned in Monday, which would be June 1st by noon, in order for them to count as a May transaction. Okay, so believe it or not, Monday, June 1st, that's real, that's happening. So just keep that in mind. And that's all we have from the Market Center. So Mary, whenever you're ready, you can take it on.
All right, thank you, Kayla. Good morning, everyone. It is hard to believe that June is just around the corner, and not as hard to believe since we actually saw that ball of fire in the sky this weekend. So we thought we would take this opportunity to tap the shoulders of some people who are really, really, really good at holding transactions together. And as a market center, since everything has started to happen with the coronavirus, we've seen higher rates of contracts falling out. And we thought it would be helpful if we were able to bring to you some of the experts in our market center at holding transactions together. So Jill Fergus gladly agreed, and Rachel Alley. So thank you both for being our celebrity guests this morning. Or celebrity
like we're
realtors.
Not always here.
So we're going to encourage, we have a few questions that we put together that we thought, might address some thoughts and questions that you have. However, we're going to encourage you also to type any questions you have into the chat bar. Kayla has definitely got many things to add to her resume through all of this. One of them is moderating Zoom calls. She's phenomenal at it. So the first thing that we wanted to talk about, or just have you guys describe a really challenging transaction that you've been able to hold together, and I think primarily related to this new environment that we've all been exposed to. So Jill or Rachel, whoever wants to start, go right ahead.
I'll let Jill start. I'll take
Okay. What I've been noticing, and I'll talk in specifics a little bit, but in general, about what's been happening now in our environment, at least what I see, is that buyers are using the inspection time period as like a, do I really want this house kind of time period, and not just using it for inspections. So contracts are falling apart or attempting to fall apart for reasons that are not home inspection issues at all, but because that 10-day time period or 7-day time period or whatever is there, I mean, that's what it's being used for. So whether or not people are getting scared or they think they've gone into contract too fast, they use the home inspection time period just as a kind of get out of jail free card to get out. And if there's no earnest money that's already been collected, it makes it even easier to do that. Specifically, I've had a very challenging one in that I actually had the seller and the buyer had their home inspection and decided they didn't want to purchase the house at all and sent over a termination. So I asked the other agent, do you really want to think about it first and have them reconsider, because there wasn't really anything wrong with the house. They were just using that time period. So they reflected for a little while and then came back and said, okay, they told the truth. They said, yes, the buyers are scared, and they just need a little bit of time to think about the whole process of being in contract during this time, what their move will look like, how it will feel. And they feel that they were rushed at the beginning and now they're scared. So then I talked to the sellers and I said, okay, here's the situation. They're going to terminate, they've terminated. But if we want them to get back in contract, we need to give them a couple days just to think about stuff. So would you be willing to do that and take them back at the same terms and conditions? And the seller thought about it and said, yes, they would. So we went ahead and proposed that to the buyers. And we're in contract and everything is going smoothly. And I think what solved that situation was communication, and being everybody, all parties being actually honest with each other after the first bit about terminating just because they could and had the chance. So I found that as much communication as possible, especially now, is helping a lot.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Jill. Thanks for that perspective, because I think it's really easy for us to get our backs up and to become very defensive. We go to that closed mindset instead of that open mindset.
Right.
So that's a big kudos to you and everybody in the transactions. So awesome. How about you, Rachel?
Yeah, so we've had some tough ones lately, and I think what it boils down to, and I have a little bit of a different perspective than Jill, which is always great for education. Really what I'm seeing is a separation between buyer psychology and seller psychology. So the sellers being in the market of the moment, expecting to not have to do anything, expecting to sell well above listing price, basically have a breeze of a transaction, which we've had these last couple years. And from the buyer psychology standpoint, what I'm seeing, they're really crunching their numbers. They are crunching their numbers going in. They're being conservative as possible with the unknown of what the future may look like. And so when we get to a point of inspection and there are some issues that they feel insecure about, or the cost of what that would take to remedy, we start to have a gap between seller and buyer expectations. And so we've spent these last few weeks really working through some tough remedy conversations between both parties. So what I'm seeing is a difference between maybe, and that's just allows us the opportunity to change the conversation that we're having with our clients as we move forward. So the conversation that we're having with our buyers may look one way, and the conversation that we're starting to have with our sellers will probably look a little bit different than the conversation we've had the last couple of years. And so that's really the gap that I've seen. And the skill that comes in the middle of that is being able to negotiate for both parties. And Aaliyah on my team, she's great too. We work through a lot of requested remedies. We work in a couple different sectors of the market, and they show up. And sometimes the asks are a little bit greater in cost. And so being open in communication, like Joe was mentioning, being collaborative rather than opposing with the other agent. There was one, I'm thinking about one transaction specifically that we were working through, and it was a tough negotiation. It was an as-is sale. We found mold in the attic during inspections. I represented the seller, and I got on the phone with the buyer, the buyer's agent, the buyer's parents, the buyer's inspector. I did not put my sellers through that. They allowed me to be on that conversation on their behalf. And just sometimes it's that peace of mind. I think it's intimidating when you're on opposing sides, or if you feel like you're on opposing sides, to say, okay, we understand that there's mold in the attic. We understand that this is an as-is contract. We also understand that we're going to have this conversation again if we don't work towards a solution. and just kind of putting the other agent so that they can have that conversation with their buyer at ease to say, you know, we're in this together. We want to do what's right. The end goal is to get someone into a new house and get the seller out of the house so that they can move on with their life, and being able to negotiate through that. And it really comes down to communication. As young as I am, I'm a big fan of picking up the phone, because there's a lot that you can hear and you can pick up on, or the insecurities of other people when they're having those conversations. And it's also an opportunity to help them understand the perspective of the seller, and that they're really, you know, good people and they're trying to do the right thing within reason, and what that compromise might look like on both sides. So that's an example of what we've been dealing with.
That's great. And I love that you had the whole family involved in the conversation, the parents and that's awesome.
Yeah, that was a unique situation. That doesn't happen a lot, but the buyer's agent was having a challenging time having that conversation on his side, and he felt it would be helpful if I helped him with that. And we were able to kind of put that buyer's mind at ease, just saying, you know, we want to do the right thing. We understand this is your first home. This is an intimidating process. Like, we get it. Now, how do we move forward?
That's great. So on the heels of that, what conversations are you having in advance with both your seller clients and your buyer clients? Because what I'm seeing is 2 years ago, as is kind of meant as is. I don't feel like as is as is, in terms of a contract, you know, in terms of no remedy, what have you. So what do those conversations look like with your sellers and buyers to prep them for the process?
Well, I'll kind of answer that in two parts. When I take a listing, what I do is I walk through the house with the seller and I explain to them, you know, it's kind of as Rachel was saying, it's not always a slam dunk anymore. And there are things that your house will have to have that are in good condition, and buyers will be picky. You know, they're going to pay top dollar most of the time, but they will be picky. So I walk through and I point out anything that I think can be questionable, you know, and I urge them to over disclose everything. If their HVAC is older, I ask them to please go ahead and get it serviced. So we have a receipt saying it's serviced in a good working condition. And if for some reason it's not going to be in good working condition, then we face that at the beginning. We're proactive. I explain about radon, how a buyer will always ask for radon. So anticipate that. Even if you have a radon system, chances are, I mean, 50% of the time it's not working properly anyway, if it's older than a couple years. So a buyer will have a radon inspection even if you have a radon system, and they will want it fixed. So I tell them to expect all these things ahead of time. And then on the contract side, I tell them that if we get a contract and the buyer says, okay, you know, as is condition, only doing inspection for informational purposes only, that's really like usually a fake thing, right? You know, Rachel's nodding. Yeah, because what will happen, you have the inspection, you know, the buyer says, oh, I'm going to terminate because I don't like whatever. The buyer says, oh my God, the seller then is like, oh no, what is it? You know, I can probably fix it. So it turns into a negotiation at that point. So I tell them when we get an offer, don't let that really reassure you, you know, because chances are if something is really wrong, you're going to have to fix it anyway. So basically I kind of prepare them all along the way to that. The other thing, when you, in a competing situation, sometimes when you get a lot of offers and many of them are about equal and they're as is, will not ask for anything, you know, a lot over asking price, and the house is relatively clean, you know, in my own judgment. Sometimes what we have done, and other agents have done this back to me too on the other side, is say, okay, go ahead, have your home inspection, that's fine. But if you do terminate because of the home inspection, then we get to keep your earnest money, or we get to keep half your earnest money. And then that takes away that part of the buyer, you know, that doesn't let them have that leverage so they can just terminate for no reason. I also try to get earnest money within 3 days, you know, for my seller, because even though if the contract falls apart, it's going to be a pain and get stuck or whatever, you know, and it'll be kind of awkward getting it back sometimes. I think it's very important to make a buyer make a commitment, especially if they are saying as is to buy. So
yeah, and I agree with Jill on the proactive versus reactive conversation. You know, that scenario that I was telling you about where we found mold in the attic, I had that conversation with my sellers during the negotiations when we received that offer, and it came across as is, but also knowing that this was a first-time home buyer, making sure that we talked about what the expectations were going to be and what some of those bigger items, if they showed up during inspections and became a concern, would be a topic of conversation. So when it came back to the table that they wanted mold remediation, the sellers already expected something. They weren't caught off guard. I didn't have a fluffy fun conversation about it. Like, we had very realistic expectations as to if something came back that we needed to disclose to another buyer, that was going to be on the RPD and we'd have to get updates and things like that, that sometimes it's easier to work through the existing contract because we probably got it at a higher price, with better terms than what we would if we went back on the market. And you know, talking them through that process and what that would mean to go back on the market versus addressing the issue at hand. What we've also started to do with our seller clients, knowing that the mindset of the buyer and seller consumers are starting to adjust a little bit, we started providing them with a pre-listing like inspection checklist. So we're making them check all of these different things. We're giving them the resources up front. So as they're preparing the listing, they kind of have their little to-do list and they can check things off, little things that show up. Because I think it is overwhelming for a buyer to get that large report of all the odds and ends of things that are wrong or that aren't perfect condition for the home. But also, like Jill said, walking through the listing and pointing out some of the things that we know will be concerned. And we want to make sure that we're attracting as many buyers to yield the highest net return for our seller. So addressing those things proactively provides buyer confidence while they're walking through the home. And then from the buyer perspective, being realistic in those consultations about what type of report that they're going to get, giving them a sample of what that looks like. We have an all in or all out conversation a lot of times with our buyers. Like, you're either all in or you're all out. So you either love it and you're going to go for it, or you're just not. And maybe it's not the one for you. And that's okay, whatever they decide. And I think that helps because it tethers them to the house. They really question their intention and they really question their commitment when we have the all in or all out conversation, so that when we start to move through this process, and we do take the time proactively to talk to them about, you know, there's always going to be mold. Yes, there's going to be radon, like all of those things that will show up, and then they're pleasantly surprised when they don't. But having that proactive conversation with them to set the proper expectations for what that report's going to look like, because it is overwhelming. You just fought to get into contract on a house. You feel like you gave everything away, and then you get hit with what I call the honey-do list of all kinds of items that will cost money to repair. And that starts to become overwhelming, and they start to really mentally second guess that house and that condition of that house and whether or not they're really wanting to move forward. So we have a lot of proactive conversations with both sides in order to get to the end result, which is getting them to closing.
Rachel is absolutely right about the are you in or are you out conversation. My version of that is to tell people never buy something because of fear of loss. Don't let that motivate you. You know, make sure you love this house and you want to buy it, because every little thing that is wrong with it now will amplify hugely once you live here. So make absolutely sure. And before the market got super fast, I always made sure that the buyer would go back a second time. And I still try to do that if at all possible, and take a family member or a friend with them to reality test. Because when we're with the buyer, we don't know the buyer as well as their family members do, and we have a different perspective. But if they can get somebody that they really and truly have trusted for a long time, in there with them, and that person reinforces that, yeah, I do think I can see you here. I can see you living here. Or no, you don't like big yards, so what are you even doing, kind of thing. I mean, I think that makes the buyer stick to the transaction much more, because if a buyer actually wants a house and can see themselves living there and feel strongly about that, the inspection issues tend to kind of resolve themselves, you know, because they're actually committed to the house. So make sure your buyer is committed before you actually even get them into contract. And tell them, you know, once we get into contract, yes, we can get you out of that contract, but chances are it will take money, it will take time. So we can unspool things, but it's much more pain than it's worth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and even if you don't have earnest money, it's still close to $1,000 in inspections and appraisal fees and things like that if they've spent the money. So those are great words of advice.
Actually, I just thought about something else. And Lori might even want to chime in on this. Now, in the market we've had the last couple years, if a buyer gets out of contract, the seller has been easily able to get it back into contract for about the same amount of money. So very rarely has there been an issue where a seller can't get the house back into contract for a reasonable amount. But if we get into a market where our buyer's in contract at a certain price, it falls out of contract because our buyer has breached for some reason, and it can be proven that that buyer has breached, then the seller will have an actual issue of really being able to sue that buyer for the difference between the purchase price, the new purchase price, and what they were willing to pay. We haven't had to worry about that for years because that hasn't been a scenario. But should the market start to decline rapidly, I mean, that's going to be a real issue. So that's something we always have to tell buyers about. It's a natural consequence that can happen when they breach or try to breach.
And I actually, Jill, just to piggyback off that, I had a scenario within the last year where I was subpoenaed for that exact situation.
Yeah.
Yep, those are great points. Great points. Very different conversations, and that's kind of the point of this, is just to really prepare for a market that's more balanced. Now, have you guys seen much fallout with financing matters?
I haven't really yet seen that. And I though try to make sure that the pre-approval letter is coming from an actual real bank. You know, when I get one, I call that lender, you know, especially if I don't know them. I call them and I say, I haven't worked with you before, so walk me through how you work with a buyer, and have you actually even done all the work needed to qualify this buyer? I know I have this letter, but basically, have you checked everything? You know, and I also talk to the buyer's agent before I do that. And I say, I don't know this person. You know, do you know this guy? You know, or this lender? Have you talked to them before? Have you worked with them? If not, I say, so what do you think? Does this make you nervous? You know, and sometimes they say, yeah, it does. You know, I don't know this lender either. You know, and so I say, well, okay, then why don't you have them talk to a different lender? And if you don't have somebody who can respond fast, I do, and let's work this out today. You know, so I'm pretty proactive in dealing with the lenders of whatever buyers trying to buy one of my listings. You know, and occasionally I will have to then, like, halfway through the transaction, if something bad happens, I then will give another lender, you know, and say, okay, I'll tell my lender the scenario, try to find one that will match up, and say, okay, you got to work with this person now to save the transaction.
I have the same conversation, and I think, Lori, this is one of the calls I made to you, gosh, when all of this started to happen, was, what can I ask? What am I allowed to ask?
You can ask anything.
What am I allowed to ask the lender? And really it came down to when unemployment started to raise and people were losing their jobs or getting furloughed was having a conversation with the lender about the last time they did employment verification. That was a big topic when everything started to happen. And again, I always call the lender, I introduce myself if I haven't worked with them before, I ask them about their process, just making sure that I am helping my seller, because the worst thing I can do for them is to get them in contract without a viable pre-approval. I always look at the dates on the pre-approval letters, and if they're more than 60 days old, I always ask for an updated one. Little things that we need to pay attention to. I know that the pre-approval letters come through. I don't know if everybody takes the appropriate time to look at them or if they just trust them. But I do advise my team and myself to make sure that we're keeping our pre-approvals up to date. Our current buyers are talking with their lender regularly. We always talk with them again before we submit an offer to make sure that everything is in alignment and there have been no changes. And then on the seller side, asking those questions proactively to make sure credit's been pulled, employment's been verified, things like that, that can dampen that process and really cause it to fall out. But I haven't seen too much. I think right in the first 2 weeks well, I guess it was the last 2 weeks of March, we got a lot of pullout, and I think a lot of that was just buyer insecurity. And then there were some job losses. We lost some of our buyer pipeline to job loss, but we weren't through the process. And for the most part, everybody that had started the process was able to finish out the contract.
Good. That's great. And these are, I'm thinking of my coaching group this week, and one of the things we're talking about is value proposition, and what a great opportunity to provide, especially to your listing clients, about the extra steps that you take anytime you do receive a contract. So that's fantastic. So I know we're coming up on just about a half hour here. So would you guys each want to share some parting advice, like the when you're working with another agent, what's the best situation you can hope for? I know we talked about communication, so maybe we'll go past that one, but to be able to either deliver the best offer, or if you're representing, if you're an agent who's bringing the offer, what does it look like on the listing side? What do you like to see from the listing agent in terms of when you're the buyer's agent?
You can go first, Rachel.
This one wasn't on the list, was it, guys?
That one? Okay, so I kind of cut out a little bit, Mary, but I'm thinking piecing it together. So basically what you're asking is, depending on what side you're on of the transaction, how are you advising your clients when reviewing or presenting offers?
Yeah, what advice can you give to the agents who are on the call today about what's one thing they could really do to help bulletproof their transactions?
Consultations. If you're not doing consultations and you're not taking the time, please do. It was so interesting. I was on the phone negotiating a transaction this weekend, and the buyer's agent got licensed in 2018, and we were countering back and forth. I think there were 3 counters that were part of this transaction, and she didn't know how counter offers worked, because we've been in a market where you basically have a highest and best and you have one shot. And so she wasn't sure how that process even worked. I think for leadership in the market center, sorry, I'm putting a plug in here, really honing in on helping the agents that have been licensed in the last couple of years in this market develop those skills, to have the proper conversations with their clients and to prepare them for in-depth negotiations as the process starts to actually unfold and they're going to have certain contingencies back in place, I think would be of great value to the market center. And then as far as bulletproofing the transactions, from the buy side, we talk about competitive advantages. We've been presenting a competitive advantages sheet to our buyers that talk about different strategies that we can take to secure a contract for them, and also talk about what each one of those mean, because we sometimes tend to speak a little bit of a different language, and we have to be able to lay term that so someone else can understand that maybe doesn't do this every day. And so for us, it's easy to say, oh, do this, this, and this, and this, and you're going to have a shot. But to them, they don't quite understand what that means. So we talk through every competitive advantage, which tends to be different strategies that we use to help secure a contract for our buyer clients. and helping them truly understand what each clause that they put into that contract means so that they are committed to it. That has been really helpful in helping us bulletproof those transactions and working through a little bit of those pressure cooker situations for the buy side. And then on the seller side, it's almost the opposite, but a different conversation. So we're talking about what each one of those clauses means as they come through, talking about what the expectation of the market is based on their price point, and just preparing them for what that looks like. And so educating them on what the different contingencies mean, what their responsibility is as a seller through those contingencies, and what the ultimate goal is. I think anytime you can tie something back to the motivation, it's really helpful. So that's kind of what we've been doing.
That's awesome. I love that. I love the competitive advantage. That's super. How about you, Jill?
Yeah, I agree with Rachel in that for a buyer, go through the contract paragraph by paragraph and take time and explain every single thing about it and what it means. And since we don't do things in person very often, I mean, the way I do it is I email it over to them basically before, not in a way that they can sign it. I don't send it that way. I send them a PDF first, you know, and then I go through it and tell them, okay, you're not going to sign this. I want to make sure you understand it all. So I go over every single piece first to make sure that they understand. And it is very interesting how they don't understand it all, you know. So I make sure that they are committed, you know, like we've talked about, and make sure they understand exactly what they're committing to when they do that offer. Then when I send the offer over to the listing agent, I go ahead and explain the offer to the listing agent to make sure they understand all the terms that are in it. Because a lot of times they don't, you know, especially in a competing situation, they're going fast, or if they're new, they have no idea, you know. So I highlight the things that are important and the things they need to tell their sellers, you know. And I also, I mean, obviously I'm a lot older than Rachel, so sometimes I use that to my advantage. So younger agents will take it better if I kind of make a joke about things and say, okay, I'm not trying to be your mom. I just think, you know, and then that way they'll listen to what I say, you know, when I explain everything. And the other thing I think is that is very important, whether or not you're on the buyer side or the seller side, pay attention to your deadlines. I mean, that contract deadline sheet, you have to go by that, and you have to make sure the other agent at the beginning agrees with you, right? And then if you are coming up to a time, let's say you have the listing, okay, they've done a home inspection, you're down to the last day, you don't have a remedy yet, right? I think it's very important to call your seller, say, okay, this is the last day for them to submit a request to remedy. We don't have one yet. So either two things are happening. Three things are happening. One, they're going to get it to us later today, and then we'll have it. Two, the other agent has gotten his or her dates mixed up, and they're going to get it to us late. Or three, they aren't going to send us one. So if there's a chance that agent has gotten their dates mixed up, it's in your best interest that we find that out. Because if we pass this deadline and all of a sudden a remedy comes tomorrow, right? Contractually, you don't have to do it. But if you don't negotiate with them, then chances are the contract will fall apart for another reason, that they will then have their lender write a financing letter saying they can't get financing because we still have that deadline. So my suggestion to you is that you have me call that agent and say, okay, our remedy deadline is today. Are you going to send one over? And I view that as actually working for the seller because I'm avoiding a future problem rather than saying, okay, they aren't going to send us one. Yay, oh, it came a day late. We don't have to do it. That leads to problems and will make your transaction fall apart. So I think if there is a mistake that the other agent is making, or you think that agent is going to make, that will make the transaction potentially fall apart for your seller or your client on the other side, you know, in the future, then you need to ask your client, okay, do you want me to try to head this off and fix it now or not? And then do it.
That's great. If I had to summarize the message today, I think the word is communication all the way around. Communicating with all sides and asking really good questions. And you guys are clearly the masters at that. Well, thank you so very much for your time and your expertise and sharing with everybody here on the call, because these are the things that make a difference. And sometimes, you know, there's things we do on a day-by-day basis that we kind of take for granted or think everyone knows. And I'll tell you, I learned today. So thank you so very much. Kayla,
Thanks for having us.
questions?
And if anybody needs anything, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to help. This was the class that I used to enjoy teaching. So if anybody has anything they want to talk through, I'm available.
Yeah, just one question from the chat for you, Jill. You mentioned that you go over the contract with your buyers, and we're wondering when you do that. Like, do you do that at the buyer consult, or when do you go over it?
I go over it briefly at the buyer consultation, and then when we actually write it, I go over it in great detail then, because then it actually has meaning to the buyer. If you go over it in great detail in the buyer consultation, they've lost all interest, you know, because they don't have an actual thing they're buying at that moment, so it doesn't matter. It's once they have something they want, then they pay attention.
Great, thanks. Well, so thank you both. That was, I mean, I always learn a lot because I'm not an agent, so everything y'all say like blows my mind. So thank you. So if you guys have listings or buyer needs, we can move on to that portion of the call at this point. So if you have a listing or a buyer need that you'd like to discuss with the whole group, go ahead and just type anything in the chat and I can go through it and call on people in the order.